Hello and welcome to this month's safety call for FCA International. Today we're going to be talking about hazard communication and SDS management. Hi, my name is Michael Hartnett and I'll be your facilitator today. So without any further ado, let's get in. So I'll start out this month the same as I do every month, telling you about an FCA member benefit. That is the FCA Safety Helpline. So if you have any questions that you'd like answered by a safety professional, you can reach out to the Safety Helpline at finishingcontractors.org or 844-414-SAFE. Generally, I'm the one who'll be answering these questions, but I get back to you relatively quickly, same day in most instances, and your questions are private and a benefit of being a member of FCA, so take advantage of that. So hazard communication is really important when we're dealing with hazardous chemicals. And the finishing trades often have a lot of hazardous chemicals that they need for their job sites, whether it's paints or thinners or adhesives. These things are integral to your business. And it's important that we provide that hazard communication, right? Informing our employees of what the hazards they'll be dealing with are. And we do that through the requirements laid on us by OSHA for hazard communication. So we'll talk about those. We'll talk about some of the best practices we can use to make sure that our people are taken care of. And then we'll talk about a final rule that OSHA has recently put out that impacts the hazard communication requirements. Okay, so what is the hazard communication standard? I assume you're all pretty well versed in it, but it is that piece of information that we give to our employees that talks about what they're going to be exposed to, right? Earlier versions had the right to know for the employee, and more recently, a little over a decade ago, they changed that to the right to know and the right to understand the hazards to which employees are exposed to. So it's important that we are aware of what our standards are. We switched to the Global Harmonized System back in 2012, sometimes known as GHS or the Purple Book. And it's important that we go ahead and alert our employees to what hazards they're going to be exposed to. So like I said, in the finishing trades, there are a lot of chemicals being used. So this hazard classification system applies to classification of hazards, right? And this is something that we don't usually take too much time looking at, but we'll dig into that a little bit. More importantly, for what you're dealing with as employees, in my mind, are the labels and other form of warnings, right? Allowing our employees to know exactly what the hazards are and how to protect themselves from it. And the safety data sheets, which have more information than the labels. And when we have an incident, we really want to have these things available so we can apply first aid and so that we can take it to the emergency room if we have a larger problem. So the hazard communication standard, when we switched to GHS, we changed our hazard classification, right? And our hazard class has to do with different specific outcomes, right? Carcinogen, toxic, explosive. What are those exposures? And then the hazard category determines the severity. And this is where we kind of did a switch, because with our older system, we had, it was written in American perspective. In an American perspective, the higher the number, the higher the hazard. Right? That's intuitive to us here. That's how most of our systems are set up, but that is not true for the rest of the world. And the GHS, Globally Harmonized System, is a global system. So they have their hazard categories set up a little bit different so that the lower the number, the more severe the hazard, right? So it's important that we're aware of that when we're looking at SDSs, when we're determining what materials we will be using on site, right? When we have a client request a specific material, we should definitely be looking at, our SDSs ahead of time to see what type of protections we need, and if we're dealing with a new hazard category or a new hazard that we haven't dealt with in the past. So this purpose is to provide that information to the employees, right? They're going to be handling the products. They're going to be exposed to those products. We need to make sure they have the information to know not only how to protect themselves, but why. So often asked, when does the hazard communication apply? It's definitely going to apply to finishing contractors, right? We are going to be handling and using said chemicals. So there's no question that your workers can be exposed to those chemicals. And anytime, what is that exposure? Anytime an employee comes in contact with it, right? So we have different routes of entry, which we always train on pretty heavily when we're doing our hazard communication training. We need to make sure that your employees understand that it's not just drinking a material or breathing a material that can be a hazard, right? Inhalation is likely the highest exposure that we have, but you know, if we have people washing their hands with solvents at the end of the day, which is something I saw a lot back when I was in the finishing trades, that absorption, where it goes through the skin and absorbs into your bloodstream, is a real issue, right? And a special hint here, you can pretty much get any material off your hands using baby oil. There's no need to go to those solvents. So if you want to share that wisdom with your people, it can help expand their lives. Right? Ingestion and injection are a couple of their hazards, routes of entry that we need to be aware of and make sure our employees are as well. So some of the requirements for that hazard communication program that you as employers really need to know is that you have to have a written program, right? And if you don't have a written program, there is one available through the FCA manual that is available through for members. And that communication program goes through all of those requirements, right? Describe how the criteria will be met. It's important to know how are we going to fulfill those requirements. Maintained at each workplace. Well, that becomes pretty challenging when we're dealing with the fact that we have multiple workplaces all over the job sites. It's really a fluid thing. Right? We're going to multiple different areas. So how do we manage that? We need to make sure that we define that within our hazard communication program. List of chemicals used in the workplace. This is a challenge, right? Especially when we're getting new materials in all the time and changing what materials depending on the scope of the work that we're involved in. It's important that we stay on top of our SDS management and we stay on top of making sure that our chemicals are listed, that we do have a hazardous material list, right? Or a chemical inventory list is what the requirement is, right? So let's make sure we keep that list in a central location. Make sure that we have those labeling requirements, right? And we'll go over those in a little bit, although I'm sure this is not the first time you've gone over them. But most importantly, that SDS management. Right? How are we going to make sure that the information is needed in case of an emergency? Because during an emergency and during pre-planning are when those SDSs are the most important. So our safety data sheets are very important. Right? They have 16 different sections of them, and they need to be available for our employees. Right? And I know a lot of us are using digital access to those, and that works well, as long as we have cell service at our work sites. Right? If we have work sites without that cell service, not really as helpful. We want to make sure that we can provide paper copies to medical facilities. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But we need to make sure those SDSs are available. If we have MSDSs as part of our chemical inventory, we really need to reach out to the manufacturer and get an updated one, right? Because the new SDS sheet is different than the material safety data sheet. The MSDS had the same 16 pieces of information, but they did not have a format, so it could be hidden anywhere within a document that was sometimes, double digits length. So having a 16 section format is really helpful, right? And when it comes to that 16 section format, there are certain things that are really valuable to us, right? Some of these sections we are going to be dealing with more often than others, right? Identification tells us how to protect ourselves, how to realize it's there, right? How it can hurt us. This is all really important. Section 2 gives you that information. It'll also tell you what the labeling requirements are and what pictograms need to be on that piece of information. Section 4, first aid, right? First aid tells us how to respond to it. Section 5 is in case of a fire. Really important that our people in the field understand how to respond in case of that emergency. If we get leaks and spills, how do we clean them up properly? That's section 6. Section 8 tells us what PPE we should be wearing to protect ourselves from those hazards, right? So these are important sections for us to know. There are other important sections that may apply to you, right? If we're looking at our warehouse, we want to know about storage for materials, especially if we have a lot of flammables. And these sections are going to help define that. So the sections I have listed here, 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, they're not the only ones, but they are the ones that we're going to utilize the most as employers. So how do we use those SDS? Well, looking at what we are going to use to protect our employees, right? PPE should not be a generic that we put out. Well, we got everybody gloves and safety glasses, hard hats, have them wear steel-toe boots, right? When we're dealing with chemicals, we often have to get more specific than that, right? Because different materials are going to eat through different gloves at different rates. And we want to make sure that what we're using for protection will protect our employees from the specific materials they're dealing with. Hazard communication also talks about those safety data sheets, and emergencies is that second area where we're really going to need to use a safety data sheet, right? So if we have that exposure, if we have that injury, then we need to make sure that we can get that information to our medical providers, right? Access to emergency response actions information is critical. Getting to an emergency room with an injection injury is terrible, right? But the difference in how they handle it often depends on the chemical properties of the material injected. Right? The depth with which they need to clean those wounds changes depending on whether we're dealing with a toxic or a non-toxic material. And if doctors are almost always going to go the extra mile and be extra careful if they don't have that information, which can then extend the length of recovery and extend the amount of pain and impact that we have on our workers. So making sure that we have paper copies available for the specific chemicals on a site is crucial. We want to be able to bring that piece of paper with us to the emergency room or with us to that occupational health clinic so that the medical providers know exactly what they're dealing with. Now, this can be challenging, but with the nature of our job sites being transitional, right, transitory, we need to make sure that we put together a packet for each job and have it put in the gang box that's sent out to the job, right? Not every SDS that you have on the site, but we know the scope of our work. We know what materials we are going to be using on a specific job. We have to order those materials. Part of that needs to be putting together a package of SDSs. Most of the time, your general contractor is going to be requiring that you provide that list to them anyways. So while we're doing that, let's gather our SDSs. Instead of giving them a generic answer, let's give them a specific answer and provide our workers with the specific SDSs they need for their job. Right? So before that ambulance arrives, we need to have that SDS available. Give that to those responding emergency technicians or bring it to the ER and give it to the doctor themselves. Extremely important that we give them that information. So labels I'm not going to pound on too much. We know that labels are required, right? We've all gone through the training that says what different sections of the GHS label have to have on it, right? So we need to make sure that we have labels. And if we have gasoline cans, the standard DOT can does not comply with OSHA requirements, right? It complies with DOT requirements. So you may need to add an extra tag on this, right? This is always the information that needs to be on that tag or on that label is found in section 2 of the SDS, right? It clearly spells out everything that needs to be on that. So let's look at some label issues. Right here we have a GHS label on the left, and on the right we have what is printed on a DOT gas can, right? And these are two different regulatory agencies that require different information. So when we're talking about the GHS, they're both going to have the identifying name, right? They're both going to have the warning level, right? Warning or danger, and what the hazard is, what we need to do to prevent from having that hazard, right? So far we're pretty good, but a precautionary statement is required for DOT and it's not part of the GHS label. While the pictograms that are required by the GHS are not on the DOT containers. So oftentimes what we're going to do is find ourselves needing to have multiple labels on those gasoline cans, right? Most of our materials, when they come from the manufacturer, are going to have the correct GHS label on it. But those gas cans are a little bit different because we fill it ourselves. Okay, so our secondary container labeling, or our labeling of containers that have gotten their label damaged, or it's not legible anymore, or has material on it so you can't read it. That's a common occurrence. So when we have that occurrence, we should have our employees prepared with what they need to correct it. Right? So on the right is one example of a product that's available. You can go out and in the field write what the product is, write that signal word, write in the hazard statement, the precautionary statement, and the PPE. Right, and then we go ahead and check which pictograms are relating. Right, so we have a fully compliant SDS label or GHS label available in the field that can be written as needed. Right, and if it's a DOT material, you can even go ahead and put that DOT information in there as well. So our list of hazardous chemicals in the workplace is something we're required to have. This should be maintained in the office and have a master list of all product names and all manufacturers, their address. We need to make sure that we write on this what we call the material in the field. Right, so all of the chemicals have to be listed. What you're using in your maintenance department, and the work over at the warehouse, what you're using, on the sites themselves. These all have to be listed in a master list of hazardous chemicals that you keep for the company as part of your hazard communication program. Right? It needs to have a unique identifier. Product name must match the SDS. But if you have a material that goes by one name, right, in your common vocabulary within your company, but has a different written name, then make sure we make note of that both in our SDS books and in our chemical inventory, right? We want to make sure, and here's an example. When I was working in a chemical facility, when I first moved in, they had the most hazardous chemical that they were dealing with was one that could cause occupational asthma, right? Provide a lifelong condition for exposure. It was what they call a respiratory sensitizer. So this was a hugely important and hazardous chemical that was used in this facility, and everybody really had to have an understanding of it. So everybody knew it. And when we went to go look in the SDS book for it, there was nothing there. It was isocyanate is what we called it, because it was an isocyanate, which is a class of chemicals. But the specific chemical that it was defined on the SDS was rubinate 1225. Right? So when I went to frontline employee and asked, can you find this SDS? They could not, because it wasn't the isocyanate. Right? When I asked the superintendent or the frontline supervisor, they also could not find that SDS, because what they called it in the workplace and what its actual chemical name were different. Right? So it took until I got to a chemical engineer who was able to lead me to the correct name for the product. Now, that's a real problem. We want to make sure that if we use a different word for a material like Benny, we're going to want to make sure that we have both the word that we use for it, the name that we call it, and its actual name in the chemical inventory and in your SDS book. And you have to have the SDSs for all those chemicals. So here's the example that I talked about just a second ago about the product name having a different name, right? We always called it isocyanate or MDI. And yet, the chemical name itself, which was MDI, isocyanate, was not on the SDS where we could find it, right? It's in the description, but certainly not how you find an SDS when looking through your SDS book. So make sure you have those names. Make sure that if you use a separate name in that workplace, that you have it listed on both the SDS and that chemical list. Right, so managing your SDS, you want to review that list annually. Right, and this is one of those light duty jobs that you can utilize any employee that may be injured to go through and update, make sure your SDS book is in line. Make sure that they have SDS packages put together for each of the upcoming jobs. Right? We want to make sure that when we have somebody injured, we're returning them to work as soon as possible, getting them back to full pay and no lawyer commercials as quickly as we can. And light work like reviewing your SDS annually and your hazardous chemical list annually is one of those jobs that can be done. Right? We want to make sure that we have those up-to-date SDSs for each site. Right? Retail items that are intended by the manufacturer or used as intended by the manufacturer, like goof off. Right? As long as we have that regular retail can that has the retail warnings on it, we do not require an SDS in the workplace. Right? That can for consumers is sufficient. Right? But when we start going to chemicals that we're dealing with every day, then in bulk or larger ones, we're going to want to make sure we have that SDS label. So you want to make sure that your SDSs are complete and put together consistently in the same way. So if you put together an SDS book for each of your job sites and you do it alphabetically, then keep doing it alphabetically across the board. Right? When we need that SDS, sometimes it's ahead of time before there's an incident. but oftentimes we neglect that in the field. Right? Oftentimes our foremen aren't spending the time to go through the SDSs before they start that job. Right? That is best practice. That should be what's happening, but it isn't always realistic in the field. Right? So we want to make sure that those SDS books are organized consistently so that in an emergency, what the person is looking for can be found. Right? And we want to have those local copies available in the work areas. And we really want to have them so that they are specific to that area. Right? Inspect it and update it regularly. So keep those updated books on your foreman trucks for mobile work, right? Or keep it in the gang box for a site, right? Whether it's a static site or one that's there for just 2 weeks, right? We want to make sure we have that. If we have somebody that's doing troubleshooting, going from site to site to site, they may want to just have that SDS book of what they carry in their vehicle. Right? Don't rely exclusively on online or electronic resources because access to the internet, dead cell phones, these are issues that we have commonly. Right? We want to make sure that we have that access wherever we are. So those site-specific SDS books really work, right? It is not a legal requirement that you have site-specific SDS books. I don't want to give you the impression that it is a legal requirement, but what it is best practice, right? We really want to make sure that the resources required in an emergency are available. So the requirement is that you have an up-to-date SDS book. When you have mobile work, you're allowed to keep that at a central location. But we want to make sure that all of our employees have access to it. And it's going to be hard to argue they have access to it if they don't come to the shop. Right? So you need to make sure that all workers are aware of its location and how to use it. You want to make sure you're providing that awareness training of all the hazards, right? You want to make sure that when you have new chemicals, new chemical classes, new hazards that they haven't dealt with before, that we are training our employees on it, right? Specifically, it needs to talk about the hazards, protective measures, emergency response, and first aid. All of that information is in the SDS. Right? So having your employees annually review the SDSs that they deal with commonly and documenting it is a best practice and will help show that you're in compliance. Right? If an SDS is pulled and provided to emergency services during an incident, we want to replace it immediately. And OSHA is updating the hazard communication standard. All right, this has already gone into effect last month, and it changes a little bit with labels. It adds a new hazard class and new hazard categories, and then it kind of reduces the freedom that manufacturers have as far as trade secrets. It still has to give you more information, or now needs to give you more information than it did in the past. So labels on small containers. If we have small containers, less than 3.5 ounces, then we do not need to put the hazard statement and precautionary statement, right? If it states that the full label's on the original packaging, and the full label is on the packaging, and the container stored in the original packaging when not in use, right? So if we have one of those smaller containers that we use for cleaning things, such as, again, goof off, then that some of those labeling requirements are reduced if we keep it in the box it came in that has all that information on it. Right? For less than half a teaspoon, it only requires a product identifier, right? So if it's a very small container, I mean, half a teaspoon is pretty small, the manufacturer can demonstrate it's impractical to put a label on something that small. And once again, that full label needs to be on the package, and the container needs to be stored in that package when not in use. Right? So if we have something really small that's just an eyedropper worth or individual blisters that can release that material, we need to make sure we have that original packaging to put it in if it's not going to have any information on it beyond the product identifier. So GHS labels for bulk shipments, now OSHA allows it to be placed on the container, which is currently required, or just sent with the bill of lading. Right? So if you have bulk chemical shipments, it does not require the label to be placed on it anymore. Right? It used to be required, but now they can just send that SDS with the bill of lading so that covers them completely. Additionally, OSHA has clarified some information on updating labels. If there's a new hazard that's added, if a manufacturer determines that something they did not have on their label before, they need to put on their label, you have to, within 6 months, update your label. Right? The manufacturer has to update labels for all containers they haven't shipped yet, but ones that they've already shipped out, it's our responsibility to update it within 6 months. OSHA also added a new hazard class, desensitized explosives. This is not something that I see as impacting your industry. And 3 new hazard categories: unstable gases, pyrophoric gases, and non-flammable aerosols. None of these are, well, possibly non-flammable aerosols, but the other 2 are not likely to be hazard categories you have to deal with. Now the trade secrets. Trade secrets in the past on the SDS, it could claim trade secrets without giving much more specific information. Now it has to give you a range of what specific chemicals are in it. If they want to call trade secrets so they don't give you the formula, then they have to tell us what percentage that material is within a range, right? So from 0.1 to 1%, or from 60 to 80%, right? That way we can still have an informed understanding of what we are dealing with in chemicals, but they don't have to give up or give a recipe specifically for how their competitors can remake what they make. All right, so again, this is not going to be something that impacts you greatly. It's just more information you'll have on the SDS that you did not have in the past. And that's what we have for today. I want to thank you for your attention. Once again, remind you of the FCA member benefit of answers to your safety questions. Call that safety helpline at 844-414-SAFE, or reach out to us via email on safetyhelpline@finishingcontractors.org. Don't forget to take advantage of those member benefits for FCA, and we'll talk to you next month. See you live even. All right. Thanks. Have a good day.